Well, hello and welcome to this EPC online policy dialogue. Good afternoon to all who are in Europe and good morning to those of you watching from across the Atlantic. My name is David O'Sullivan. I am the chairman of the governing board of the European Policy Centre, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Our theme is China, extreme competition or cautious cooperation, the case for a responsible transatlantic strategy for China and East Asia. So lots to talk about, one of the big topics of the moment. Before I introduce our two speakers, just a little bit of housekeeping. I think those of you who are, I think we're all becoming relatively familiar with this thing now. There is a chat function. If you want to ask questions, you can type it in directly to the chat. Please let it be a question and not just a comment. And if you prefer, you can raise your hand, and in the course of the question and answer session, which we'll do roughly 30 minutes into the conversation, we can unmute you and let you put your question live, assuming the technology permits us when we get there. So having said that, I would like to introduce our two panelists who speak from both sides of the Atlantic. We have Michael D. Swaine, who is the director of the Quincy Institute's East Asia program and one of the most prominent American scholars on Chinese security studies. He joined the Quincy Institute from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he worked for nearly 20 years as a senior fellow specializing in Chinese defense and foreign policy, US-China relations, and East Asian international relations. He also served as a senior policy analyst at the RAND Corporation, and he has just co-authored a very big piece on a new strategy for East Asia for the United States, which has just been published by the Quincy Institute, and I'm sure he'll want to talk to us about that. Here in Brussels, we have Shada Islam, known to many of you. She's a senior advisor here at the European Policy Centre, visiting professor at the College of Europe in Natalen campus, where she teaches Europe-Asia relations. And of course, she has frequently commented and written about Europe-Asia relations going back many years. She was the EU correspondent for the Hong Kong-based Far Eastern Economic Review and director of Asia at the Friends of Europe think tank. She now runs her own global strategy and advisory company, New Horizons Project, based in Brussels. So we have, I think, really two very well qualified panelists to take us through the considerable issues which arise around the rise of China, the situation in East Asia, a new administration in the US wanting to reach out to allies, to have a more concerted approach to the issue of China. But do we really share a common vision of what this problem is and how it might be solved? What are the points of convergence? What are the points of divergence? I think these are the issues we're going to want to go into in the course of this conversation. And I would just like to begin by asking both of you the sort of big picture question. I mean, I was jokingly quoting from The Sound of Music, saying, what do we do about a country called China? You know, the rise of China is undoubtedly one of the big challenges to the international order of the 21st century. It is becoming an increasingly important economic power. I think by 2030, it'll be by far the largest economy in the world. It is, of course, a massive country, also in terms of population, and increasingly it's flexing its muscles diplomatically and in security and other terms. So this is something that everyone is going to have to come to terms with. What do you think should be the approach from the United States and from Europe? So maybe I will firstly put that question to Michael to give us the view from his part of the world, and then Shada can comment from a European perspective. So please, Michael.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you, Shada. It's really a pleasure to be part of this discussion today. I've spent most of my professional life studying China, and a good deal of it in Washington, particularly in recent years. So I have that particular lens, if you will, in looking at the situation. I'm very aware of what goes on in Washington. And as you probably all know, the US position on China, I think, is somewhat unique, even among democracies. US interests with China really extend in some ways beyond what they might be with other countries, particularly because of America's commitments in Asia and its relationship to Taiwan and to allies like Japan and South Korea. We've gone through a period in the United States where the policy towards China has really shifted from one during the Obama era and before that was based primarily on hedging, what was called hedging and engagement, with a preface or a preference really on the engagement side, seeking areas of cooperation with the Chinese that would be helpful for both countries, that would reduce security competition and enhance economic growth for both countries and for the world in general, especially given China's growing economic reach in the world. And that policy lasted for several decades. Had its ups and downs for sure because of the Tiananmen massacre in '89, because of different problems between the US and China, crises that occurred in the late '90s and early 2000s. But it has now evolved into a position where the cooperative side of the equation in the relationship has really been overshadowed greatly by the competitive side. And I should say even the rivalry side. And in the United States, this has taken on and took on under the Trump administration a much more serious, confrontational, I would say even hostile stance towards China that sought more to contain and undermine China and even undermine the Chinese government in order to supposedly serve US interests. And what pushed this shift in US policy, I think, was a whole series of different developments that occurred in the late 2000s and early 2010s, and then on into this decade. And there are a whole series, ideological, political, economic, power shift that has occurred, much more pronounced, particularly in Asia, and a greater emphasis on ideology because of actions that have been taken, in particular by the Chinese government regarding its own domestic situation, but also in other areas as well. So we have now a relationship that really prizes competition first, strong competition, to a great extent, zero-sum competition over cooperation. Cooperation in American foreign policy right now is with China is kind of an afterthought. It's what you tag on after you list all the different things that you have, all the different areas where you have deep differences with China. Then you say, well, in some areas we can cooperate because we have common interest in doing so. But it's kind of a throwaway line across most of Washington. The emphasis, even under the Biden administration, is primarily on competition and mainly zero-sum competition. So I think it's moved over to the opposite extreme. It was way over there with Trump. It's moved back a little bit under Biden, but not all that much. Now, the Biden administration is still working out its China policy. It still has strategy reviews underway. So we don't know exactly how they intend to balance competition and cooperation, but it's unlikely to change in a major way from what we have seen during the Trump administration, except less rhetoric, less fiery rhetoric, less polemics, and more emphasis on trying to work with other nations, particularly Europe and Asian nations, to deal with China. I mean, that will be a much higher priority for the Biden administration than under Trump. And of course, to try to work with other countries, including China, on major transnational threats that the Trump administration basically ignored, such as climate change and pandemics. So you will see some changes, but the basic orientation of US policy and the relationship between competition and cooperation, I think, won't change in a major way.
Thank you. Shada, how do things look from this side of the Atlantic?
Yes, so as we all know, the EU, the European Commission External Action Service came up with its own outlook on China in March 2019. And that, I think, in a sense, Michael and David, sort of tried to give sort of equal attention, and that's where it's different from the American strategy, if you like, under Trump definitely, but also under Biden, equal attention and calibrate cooperation and competition, also talked about systemic rivalry. It had been said, as you know, David, that previously the European Union had been quite naive in its dealings, in its engagement with China. And this was a proof that Europe was actually becoming more grown up and more sort of vigilant about the different constraints that it faced in its relations with China, including, of course, the competitive angle. Now, obviously, at the moment, we're very focused on how we can cooperate with China on questions like climate change, also fighting the pandemic. It's absolutely essential that there's cooperation there. Looking also at Iran, trying to get everyone back in the JCPOA. So there is quite a focus at the moment on cooperation. And as you know, there's also been signature of the investment agreement with China, which created quite an outrage here in Europe as well as in the United States. People saying we should have waited for Biden to take over to do so. So there is an emphasis on cooperation, but having said that, competition is very much part of the game as well. And awareness also that on trade, we'll be competing, whether it's on connectivity, the Belt and Road Initiative, and whether it's also on issues to do with technology. I mean, obviously, we all know that these are going to be the sort of, I hate using the word battleground, but that's where we will be in competition. But the difference clearly is that we don't see here in Europe, at least most of us don't see here in Europe, or some of us don't see, it depends on who you're talking to, China as the adversary, as the enemy to be fought on all fronts, if you like. And I think it's less emotional here, it's less alarmist, a bit more sensible. And I think Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron have said very clearly that there are areas where we will not converge with the United States when it comes to values and interests, and China is going to be one of them. So just very quickly, what the Europeans are doing and what I find very reassuring is actually looking at how we can reinforce our own economic competitivity. How do we become more competitive instead of just raging and ranting against China, also build up our own defenses, our own competitive sort of assets. And finally, you know, Michael, I was working for the Far Eastern Economic Review, and I always said, Asia is not just about China. And so what's very reassuring now is that the European Union and the member states are going out there and building networks with the wider East Asian region, the Indo-Pacific region, if you like, and making China part of this puzzle that we have, which is our rather ambitious network of partners in the Indo-Pacific generally. So it's not just China-centric, China-obsessed. It's looking at the wider region, which is, of course, very important. It's not just China.
Before we go into more detail, and I think we should get more granular on some of the policies and the scope for convergence or not transatlantically, can I ask you both a somewhat provocative question? I was struck, I don't know whether any of you saw the recent BBC series, Trump Takes on the World, and they were sort of quoting from various moments in the White House under the Trump presidency. And K.T. McFarland, who was briefly Deputy National Security Advisor, used a phrase that I hadn't heard before. She described those who are soft on China, as she saw it, as the panda huggers, which I'd never heard. So she contrasted the panda huggers and the hawks. Let me just push you both a bit. Do you think that do the hawks have no point at all? Should we not be worried about China? Is China not potentially, given its weight in the system, given its very clear different views about how you organize democracy or government within countries, given its view about its own role in the region, should we not be more worried about China, or indeed is it a place where we can do business with and find accommodations?
Well, I would say that we certainly should not regard China with some kind of simple, naive, sort of Pollyannish assumption that China is nothing but sweetness and light and will cooperate with us if we give them the opportunity on everything, that their threat to us really doesn't exist, et cetera, et cetera. I think the problem is, I mean, I don't know anybody in the China field, and this includes many people who disagree very much with the Trump policy towards China, and even with some elements of the Biden policy. I don't know anyone among them, though, who thinks that China is in no way a serious competitor, if not a national security threat in the most extreme version of that word. I don't believe that China is what you would call an existential threat to the West or to the United States in any real area. In the full sense and the literal sense of that term, that it could really act to damage deeply the West, and physically, or in terms of the Western political system, or even the economic systems. But China does have the capacity to engage in activities, and is engaging in activities that do weaken democratic values in different areas around the world, that do compete sharply with the United States and Europe in both legal and very unethical, and by international laws at least, illegal ways, through massive cyber theft and other types of things. And its growing military capabilities do pose a danger of crises, greater crises, particularly in the Western Pacific. It's not that China is going to start goose-stepping its way across Asia, invading other countries, but it's all about relative power and the clash of interests in different areas, particularly in the Western Pacific, that involve potentially political military crises like Taiwan, where things could get very, very nasty. So, you know, if it's mismanaged, there is a threat there. But I'm not one of these people who believes that China has made up its mind, that it has this grand strategy of global domination, that it's going to move towards come hell or high water. It's going to go for that. That's what it needs to have in order to survive. We do get increasing zero-sum arguments being made in China by some strategists about the need for China to take its place and in the process reduce American influence. And I think China is acting more to try to reduce American influence, because as it sees the United States more dedicated itself to undermining China, there is a very clear security dilemma that's going on that operates in both directions, with each side increasingly relying on deterrence as opposed to reassurance tools in dealing with one another. And that inevitably creates risk, greater risk, and in some places, indeed, threat. So it's by no means a benign situation. In China, there are no choir boys. They are serious realists to a great degree in the international system, and they compete very, very hard.
Yes.
That's very interesting. Shada.
Yes, David, I would agree. I mean, it is, I would argue it's the first time that the West has been seriously challenged by a peer, by a country which has embedded its economy really into the mainstream economy, which is entangled in all kinds of, as I said, Belt and Road Initiative, but also is the major trading partner for, I think, over 130 countries, and has just become a major trading partner for the European Union as well, the leading trading partner for the European Union as well. So it is the first time that we're being challenged in our Eurocentric, West-centric approaches by a foreign power, by a country which is an Asian country. I mean, Japan did it as well in the 1980s, but that did not last very long. So obviously we are being tested in our own values. And I think the best way to respond actually is to be firm in our own values, in our own democracies, and as I said, to be competitive. I do not see it as an existential threat. I'll tell you what are existential threats. That's really the pandemic as we have it now, climate change, and also I would say fighting and combating poverty. Having said that, I think accommodation, coexistence is a two-way street. And if we are to live in this 21st century in our differences, with our differences, we'll have to adjust and accommodate and live together in this world. And that means that China has to adjust as well to living in harmony, if you like, with us, with the Europeans, with the West as well. And there, I think there's also a learning curve to be traveled. It's not just the West that has to learn to live with a competitor, but also China. And that means curbing some of its more assertive elements, as you said, Michael, in its neighborhood as well. And just if you look at that neighborhood, the neighborhood is also very cautious about making a binary choice between the United States and China. So I think we have to be very, very careful in not accepting that binary choice and not saying that we're just China's friends. We have a transatlantic relationship, and that will remain very vital to our foreign policy as we go forward. But China has to restrain itself as well. And my final point would be, Michael, I think you'll agree, is that we build China into this big monster, and we see it as all powerful. If you look at China as we've done and we continue to do, there are feet of clay are very, very obvious as well. And there is also the big challenge now of a middle income trap or not as China moves forward, an aging society that has to deal also with its different climate and other challenges. So yes, it's an important challenge to us in the West, but it is not, and I do not see it as an existential threat to our future.
So what then would a sensible common program transatlantically look like in terms of finding a strategy for dealing with China? I mean, if I look at the sort of three baskets of issues that I see, there is the economic and the tech basket, so the sort of industrial competitiveness writ large, the new technologies, AI, the revolutionary impact of all the technological changes that are going to completely transform our way of doing business, the foreign policy and security issues, so the regional issues, but also the China's more global role, whether that's on issues like climate change or as Shada mentioned, the Iran deal. And then the issue of values, I mean, human rights, the situation of the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Taiwan, which you mentioned, Michael, and which I think has the potential to become extremely difficult. How far should the US and the EU and then other like-minded allies, let's not forget Shada's reference to the rest of the region, so Japan, South Korea, ASEAN, India. How far should we go in trying to have a common approach? And at what point does that become counterproductive because the Chinese feel that they are somehow surrounded by a hostile environment and this makes them more defensive?
Well, I think my own view on this is that it's not really either or. I think that the US and its friends and allies, both in Asia and in Europe, do need to engage in a much deeper conversation about what China is, what its relationship is to them, what their interests are in dealing with China, where there are opportunities, where there are threats, where there are middle areas that are unclear but could be shaped by behavior on all sides. And they have to really lay out a kind of strategic roadmap as to how you're going to both engage with and, where necessary, deter and constrain and shape China. It's a big ask. It's a big task, but I think it's one that could be done. In some areas, the US and Europe are not going to entirely agree on things. You're not going to get complete agreement. And it's going to be the same way with the US and its Asian friends and allies. There's going to be tugging and hauling. There's going to be some friction. But there needs to be some basic middle ground that is going to be able to balance between these incentives for cooperation and competition in a much more effective way by getting coordinated action by the countries involved. And from my point of view, I think the European countries and the Asian countries, particularly Japan and South Korea, need to step up more and speak more about what their interests, their vital interests are vis-a-vis China, and be frank about where they differ with US policy as it emerges under the Biden administration, if indeed there are significant differences. Because the way I look at the dynamic at work right now, there's a common need to counter and balance against and develop new cooperation areas with China, yes, but there's also a need to restrain the US position from becoming too extreme on the competitive side and on the rivalry side in dealing with China. And that restraint, I think, can only come by and large from other nations, friends and allies of the United States, who make persuasive cases for why a zero-sum Cold War-like competition with China is just simply not in the cards. Now, the Biden administration, to their credit, they have stated, at least some of them, Jake Sullivan and others, before they took office, that they don't want that kind of relationship with China. They don't want a zero-sum relationship with China. They don't want a Cold War with China. So I would say, put your money where your mouth is. And what exactly do you propose that would indeed avoid that sort of thing, that's not just based on, everybody joining together to contain China or counterbalance China? I was disappointed by the recent speech that President Biden made in Munich, where he laid out a whole area of different policies and such, where the United States should work with other countries and work with Europe. And yet his description of it, and he said he didn't want just all this to just be about great power competition. We have to also pay attention to pandemics, transnational threats, all the rest of it. And yet, at the same time, he said the critical inflection point where we are in the world is between authoritarianism and democracies, which sounds a lot like great power competition if you look at China and the West. And he said that was the key inflection point we're at right now, is who is going to determine the future. So it sounded a lot like what he said they weren't doing. And then on the second thing is he made a lot of comments about what needs to be done vis-a-vis China, but it was all about what we need to do to China. It was all about how we have to prevent, resist, constrain, et cetera, et cetera. Not a word about how we will engage the Chinese alongside our allies in producing a more effective and balanced policy that can be realistic and yet at the same time not push us into more confrontational stances towards China. Not a word about that in his comments. And I think that's partly for political reasons. And it reflects the fact that in the United States right now, I mean, you can't mention China and accommodation in the same sentence. I mean, nobody on the Hill, elsewhere, it's all about how do we get China. I mean, they had over 400 bills submitted in the last Congress on China. Almost every one of them was about how to contain or counter China, not how to engage with it. So it's a big task ahead. But as I've said, I think the Europeans and the Asian allies can play a very significant role here in injecting a greater degree of balance and reality into our common policies towards China.
Thank you very much. I particularly, I was actually going to make the observation you made at the end, which is, of course, we should not lose sight, looking at this from Europe, on the domestic political pressures which this administration is under, and on the fact that being tough with China is kind of a sort of bipartisan approach, and that trying to have a more nuanced, a more sophisticated approach, including elements of cooperation and maybe even accommodation with China, will not always be very popular domestically. And this is, this administration is full of very bright and intelligent people who I think understand many of the points you've been making, Michael. But at the end of the day, they're going to be looking to the midterms, they're going to be looking to 2024. And
absolutely,
and that's what I wanted to come to you, Shada. I mean, you rightly said that Europe should not, will absolutely not want to make a binary choice between China or the United States. But if I can put you that the dilemma we face is, we certainly don't want to be decoupled economically from China, but we don't want to be decoupled politically from the United States. So how do we square that circle then? If we're going to be the ones proposing to the Americans how we can be tough on certain things, but have a policy which also has a high level of engagement and working with China.
For me, I think, David, the way forward really is, and I know that some people scoff at this idea, but it is really open strategic autonomy. I think when Europe stands up and speaks for itself and it makes its voice heard, the world is impressed, and Asians are looking to a Europe. I'm not just talking about China now, but Asians are looking to a Europe that can speak for itself, can walk outside, away from America's shadow. And I think the big challenge that we're going to have now, Michael, when we look at this transatlantic relationship going forward, is for your friends and your colleagues to look at Europe, not just in the tired old way as a junior partner, but also as an equal partner, not just a pushover, but that we can actually make our voice heard. And that, I think, stands also for Japan, Korea, and the others as well. Is America back, assuming to become the leader of a world that has really changed a great deal in the last 4 years, which was already changing, but was accelerated under Trump's America First policy? So I'm a bit confused, and I think many of us here in Europe are confused about where American leadership is going to lead us. The world has changed, and one of my friends said, the table now, he wants to be head of the table. That's what Biden says, but it's a round table. It doesn't really have a head there anymore, and it's not just because of China. So how are we going to negotiate? And my first question would be, yes, we do want to be part of this discussion, this conversation. Are we going to be listened to carefully, or are we going to be told, as we always are, we're just too soft and we're panda huggers and our voice doesn't matter? So that's going to be the first thing that's going to be important. And David, the second thing really is, do we want a world that is divided into nice and nasty at a time when we are really so entangled in our economies, in our connectivities, dealing with the pandemic? We need to work together beyond the comfort zone of like-minded countries. And that means working not just with China, also in some cases, I have to say, with Russia, but also countries in Africa and Latin America and others in Asia that we do not always see eye to eye with. So we really have to grow up and be confident enough in our own values to engage with countries that we do not always agree with. Which is why I think the idea of a D10 or an alliance of democracies that's going to be working to contain China, first of all, you can't contain China. And second of all, do you really want to build such an enormous fault lines across the world at a time when we know that our own democracies are under assault and are being eroded from within?
Turning to the audience now, I see we have a couple of questions. One really builds on what we've just been discussing, but I'll cite it anyway, from David Fouquet, who quotes former Defense Secretary Bob Gates, who observed that competition with a competitive rival, we've been there and done that for decades. We should know how to do that. And that one of the speakers at a recent US chamber said that it was insane to talk of economic decoupling. On the other hand, Mr. Fouquet points out that there are the Peter Navarros, the Mike Pompeos, and some in Europe who seem to preach a more confrontational approach. So he's saying, where are the prominent third way advocates in the US and Europe? What do you say to that? Michael, you're muted.
I would say that what the Quincy Institute is trying to do is exactly that, is to try to put forward an approach to dealing with China that is not based on just the same old rhetoric and the same old assumptions that the United States has adopted in the past, which has been based largely on the fact that the United States was the dominant power globally, and that it was certainly the dominant power in the maritime realm in the Western Pacific, both militarily and economically. Those days are gone, and I don't think they're coming back anytime soon. And US policy needs to adjust to that, and it needs to be able to develop a new type of strategy that some people have called competitive interdependence. with the Chinese that recognizes that both countries have a great stake in resolving a lot of common problems and in maintaining an international order that is going to serve everybody's interests and not melt down in some future global financial or other type of crisis. And that does require a level of competition with the Chinese that is not necessarily zero sum. We need to compete hard in some areas because the Chinese are doing so, but it's primarily in the economic and technological areas where China is a serious competitor to many countries, but not in the sense that it wants to destroy you or completely subjugate you. But we have to have a stronger ability to compete in both Europe and in Asia. And that's one of the major recommendations of our East Asia report that we published, is that the United States has to get its house in order to become both a more effective competitor, but also a better model, if you will, if you want to use that word, in terms of its own political system and in terms of its own internal ability to solve problems, which it's not a very good example for right now. So I think that, yes, what Gates said is true. We know how to compete, sure, but this competition is not the Cold War with the Soviet Union. This is going to be a very different type of competition that involves a much more international areas of engagement that is not based on zero sum. With a competitor who has deeply integrated itself into the international system in a whole variety of ways that are not going to change overnight. And I don't believe that China fundamentally threatens to overturn what we would call the global order per se. I think it wants to modify certain elements of it. It certainly wants a bigger seat at the table. It certainly wants to reduce the potential or the ability of the United States to use the global order to undermine China. That's your security dilemma again. But even so, there's ways for us to be able to compete effectively with the Chinese while cooperating. But we have to be able to establish that middle ground. And I think that's what Quincy wants to do. And I think it depends a lot on diplomacy. It depends on a greater exercise of restraint. It depends on less reliance on military tools to deal with what is, in most cases, a non-military problem. I would say that even extends to Asia to a great extent, that the problems are not fundamentally one to be solved by military means. They have to be solved by political and technocratic and economic means. And there, the United States is a very, very strong player, and it doesn't have to be a zero-sum player in all instances. So there's a basis for it to both establish relations with its friends and allies and also to engage the Chinese in more productive ways. And I think we need to strive for that kind of balance.
I'd like to come back to that point in a moment, because we have one question about standards, and I think that's but I'd like to just, on the back of what you just said, Michael, go back to you, Shada, where you said rightly, and I fully agree, we have to learn to deal with countries we don't like. But where do we draw red lines? When is it necessary to actually say, sorry, this is behavior we can't accept? I think of what's happening in Hong Kong. I think of what's happening to the Uyghur. I mean, you mentioned Russia. We could talk about Ukraine, but I'm just saying, where do you get this balance between cooperation, engagement, but at the same time having certain certain norms of behavior, certain activities which are frankly unacceptable? The interference with navigation in the South China Sea, or dubious territorial claims in the East China Sea. How do we manage that process in the way that Michael has just described? But at the same time, as you said earlier, I think, how can we also communicate to China that they also maybe need to play a role in this, of sort of defusing some of these tension points?
I think, David, one of the things that's important is that if we stop crying wolf about each and every move that China makes, which we think is a threat, and we focus on what are really the red lines. And I think there you're absolutely right. But we have to be very clear about that. I think Taiwan is obviously one of them. In Hong Kong as well, I think we've made our positions very clear in terms of, what is acceptable and what is not. But where is our capacity to act? And I think that's actually by, as Michael has said, being stronger with our own values and increasing the attractiveness of our values vis-a-vis the rest of the world, becoming more competitive. And what I worry about really is that we are out there making everything into a geopolitical competition. And when we raise our voice about the Uyghur community or the Hong Kong issue, or relations, or what's happening in the South China Sea, it's all become part of a geopolitical bashing, geopolitical competition game, whereas the real message then can be actually cast aside by the Chinese and saying, look, this is just part of your China bashing because you see us as a threat and a challenge. If we were to have a sensible conversation, which I think the Europeans actually do in many areas, have a sensible conversation with China on human rights, as it does with other countries in the world as well, without always having the reflex of thinking about sanctions and blanket sanctions, but working in a more surgical manner where it matters. The problem at the moment is that we are making everything into one big toxic mess. And it's very easy then for China to say this is all because we are challenged, we're seeing it as a threat, and because we're all part of this new zero-sum game, everything China does has some toxic and negative element to it. So we've become our own worst enemies, if you like, and we're losing the message because we're confusing it with too many distractive elements in it. But there are red lines, and there should be red lines, as there should be for everyone else as well. But who is going to actually do that? And at the moment, what we have to do is reinforce our global rules. And that, as Michael has just said, means that China's voice will have to be heard as well. Rule takers for too long, all of these countries want to be part of the rulemaking as well. And it's going to be very difficult. All our multilateral institutions at the moment, David, are very fragilized, not just the WTO, but the UN Security Council, the WHO, every single international organization is really fragilized at the moment. So where are the rules at the moment? That's a challenge too.
Yeah, just to comment on what Shada just said, and I entirely agree with her. I think we're in sync on most of these issues. There's a word that's kicked around now in Washington, which is securitization. And that is that every element of the US-China relationship has become securitized. What does that mean? It means every connection with China is seen as a potential national security threat. Chinese students studying in the United States, national security threat. TikTok, national security threat. Any kind of agricultural agreement, national security threat. I mean, it's become so pervasive in Washington. It just cries out for some sane, restrained analysis that really looks seriously at the realities of where China is contributing. I mean, you never hear a word in Washington these days. The World Bank states that since 2008, China's contributed to 1/3 of global growth. 1/3 of global growth. The phrase that you will see here in China, in Washington, is China engages in predatory economic practices. Sort of full stop, as if that's all there is to the truth of this. So it is an area where you have to be able to establish limits to competition and red lines. And I would say certainly human rights issues are, I mean, they're red lines in the sense that they are transgressions. I mean, the Chinese are transgressing their own constitution and some international conventions in dealing with the Uyghurs. And I think it's certainly incumbent upon the international community, but it should be the international community as much as you can that speaks to this issue, and not just the United States sitting there, because the Chinese will read this as just simply part of the US grand strategy of undermining China. And if you beat that drum in a very unilateral way, it will also undermine your efforts to try to shape and influence more moderate voices in China, because you will rise Chinese nationalism. You'll get the Chinese themselves, the people in China, more opposed to the United States. So it cannot be the sole force that's pushing back against these types of political value types of issues. And I would say in some other areas, red lines have to do with use of force. Use of force, an explicit, unprovoked use of force by the Chinese in the South China Sea regarding Taiwan, etc. Those things are unacceptable. I mean, that is not the way to try to deal with these issues. But the problem is you don't want to back the Chinese into a corner on these issues, which in the cases I just mentioned involve sovereignty. From the Chinese perspective, it has to do with sovereignty and territorial integrity. Big, big, big issues for the Chinese. You don't want to back them into a corner on these issues where they feel like their only set of options in dealing with them would be coercive or military. And we're running the risk of getting into that situation with the Chinese, particularly over questions like the South China Sea and Taiwan. And the United States rightly should stand in support of a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue, but it should not take a stand on what that resolution should be. It should remain supportive of this idea that it does not challenge China's view on what Taiwan's relationship is to China. But it needs to avoid making Taiwan into a kind of strategic asset to be defended against China, which is where we're moving in some circles in Washington. As the US-China relationship deteriorates, people think in more and more strategic terms, and they look at Taiwan and say, oh, Taiwan is a critical strategic location in Asia. We've got to make sure the Chinese can't control that. And so right there, the one China policy is out the window. And you're looking at a much more contentious, if not conflictual relationship. So yes, there are red lines, but they include areas where you have to act to deter as well as to reassure.
There's a lot of interest in your paper on that. I want to come back to this issue of standards, because one of the questions we have is about standardization, global standardization as a tool to agree, this is from Andreas Janet, to agree on trade and interaction with China. And international standards organizations are being increasingly populated by Chinese experts. One of the suggestions has been in the past that we need a sort of Western alliance, like-minded alliance, to have transatlantic standards rather than Chinese standards. On the other hand, I think for the Chinese, they would like to feel that they should now be part of international unitary standards, I'm thinking, for example, for 6G or artificial intelligence or whatever the kind of standard setting we're going to have. Do we think this is the way to go, to actually bring China into the process instead of trying to say, let's agree European and American standards and then we oppose that to anything which the Chinese might promote? Shada, do you want to start on that? Yeah,
so David, this is going to be the battlefield for competition, is regulatory standards. That's what to a large extent the Belt and Road Initiative is also about. We've just looked at it as in terms of infrastructure, but there's also behind that a lot of work going on actually making sure that the countries, and there are about over 100 countries where the BRI is active in all its different facets, that also comply with certain standards that are being set by Chinese companies and by China. Also, a separate court is being set up to deal with disputes within the BRI on connectivity, etc. So the battlefield really is on who gets to set the standards for the future. And that's where I think Europe has a very strong stance, because Europe is a regulatory power. It sets its gold standard in terms of regulations and standards and norms across a wide range of sectors, consumer products, but also for services, etc. And there on digital, it's going to be extremely important who sets the standards. And I think I really worry that we'll be one world, two systems in a way, because if we do have this divergence in terms of what the transatlantic standards are about and what the China-centric standards are about, we're going to have a number of countries that fall through that gap. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. That's going to be the existential challenge, because you've seen how technology really is so important, where we will have to find ways of coming to some kind of compromises. And we've seen also, David, that during our own lockdowns, a number of things that we thought was so important to us in terms of, facial recognition, privacy about our health, etc. All of those things that we've actually given up slowly in terms of, because of the stronger interest of health, etc. So this is a fluid conversation. I think it's going to be the big issue. And I wish that we would, in fact, focus on that as an area where we need to find the new rules. And I would hate them to be two separate worlds that we're building in this area.
I would agree with that. I think that, I'm not an expert on technology and how it operates and what the process of innovation is, but the people who do know that, whom I've spoken with, to a great extent say that, look, there's a possibility that we could have bifurcation and separation in many, many technology areas. It will not serve either side's interests. It will impoverish both sides in ways that will not help the populations of either China or the United States or Europe or Asia. And the second point that they make is that in many of these areas, standards are not set by a country. Standards are set through an international process that involves engagement by many countries. And no country, including the United States in the past, has dominated that process. And so it's kind of a misnomer to say that, China is going to set the standards for the future in many tech areas. The system just simply doesn't operate in ways that would allow that unless China were to really seal itself off and set up totally independent standards that were not international standards. They would be domestic standards. And that would not help China's interests at all. So I think it's very much incumbent, again, necessary for all countries to recognize that many of these issues cannot be dealt with unless there is a basis for real cooperation. And not just talking about tech. You have things like standards and targets for clean transportation, let's say, and looking at climate change. You need to agree on common sets of standards in developing, beyond the Paris Accord, which really is just a start. And China and the US are the major emitters. They've got to be able to cooperate on what kind of standards are necessary to reduce carbon emissions globally. There's no avoiding it. If you don't do that, then the situation is going to get much, much worse, and again will impoverish all sides.
So turning to the process now, what do we think Europe and the United States need to do, bearing in mind also, I think what's emerged from this, that, it's not just up to the two of us to decide what this is. There are other players. There's Japan, there's Korea, there's ASEAN, there's India. So there's players directly in the region. What's your advice to the two on transatlantic terms in terms of coming to grips with this? How should, the Commission has proposed a trade and tech council to the United States. They've also proposed an idea which actually came from Secretary Pompeo, which I think the Europeans were less keen to engage in with the last administration, but maybe more willing to pick up with this administration of a China dialogue. But how open do you think, Michael, the US really is, as you suggested, to taking on board the views of others, or is it very much, here's our opinion, wouldn't you like to agree with it? It's often the kind of coordination I've seen with our American friends.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the Biden administration so far talks a good talk. Yeah. They are very focused on eliciting the views of friends and allies, as they say. But, and I think that's fine if they indeed are doing that and if they're listening. But, you have to start off by, first of all, getting to some basis of agreement and understanding about what it is you're dealing with. What is the scope of the threats and, I dare say, opportunities that China presents to all of us? And here, there are significant differences in just sort of diagnosing the problem, if you will. And even within Europe, it seems to me, you can correct me, there are significant differences. France and Germany are generally seen as pretty far out there in wanting to make sure that we avoid Cold War with China, want to follow up on the economic connections and advantages that they get from dealing with China. And other countries in Europe are less committed to that. So I think one big challenge is, if you really want to have a European-US conversation on this that is positive, is Europe itself needs to be able to make up its own mind in a way that it perhaps goes beyond what it's done thus far. But I would certainly support the idea of creating some kind of a commission or study group that includes Asian and European countries, but also at some point is designed to include China as well, and not just be seen as something, how do we deal with China? It has to be really something that is going to involve genuine conversation with the Chinese in ways that really do both invite cooperation, but also lay down some markers. I mean, the Chinese are very good at agreeing to a lot of things, and then implementation becomes very spotty for all kinds of reasons, both deliberate and not deliberate. And that sort of thing in particular areas has really got to stop. The Chinese have got to become much more effective in following through on what they agree to. And and people should hold them to it, just as they should hold themselves to any agreement. The United States has been a violator of agreements. So we've got to be able to have a greater level of sense of enforcement and common purpose in dealing with the Chinese. So first, get our house in order and get some level of consensus among ourselves. Secondly, define what it is that we're dealing with here and dealing with China and the international system. And then third, lay out a roadmap in ways of engaging with the Chinese on how to advance our common interests and how to diminish or reduce the sources of confrontation and tension.
Shada, I just want to, I was trying to get through this without talking about the China, the comprehensive agreement on investment, which I think has been, I agree with you, it's been somewhat talked to death, but we do have one question from Andreas Strignitz. Does the conclusion of the EU-China investment agreement constitute a problem for transatlantic relations? You might just touch on that, Shada, in picking up, because we're starting to run out. I think it'll probably be a last comment before we
Right. I don't think it should, and I think it won't. I think there was some drama and a lot of emotion at the end of last year and the start of this year. But I think the fact that Antony Blinken did take part in this EU foreign ministers meeting, and there have been some very good consultations, I believe, on Myanmar as well as on Iran, I think is an indication that there are less emotional people there who realize that the EU was looking after its interests. After all, China is going to play a big role and is playing a big role through its markets and its openness to investments, etc., in the global economic recovery. I mean, we haven't even talked about that important aspect of what lies ahead. It has to be one of our priorities. And who's going to be the biggest sort of engine, if you like? It's the East Asia, Indo-Pacific, China region that's going to be there. So we have to remember that. But on the comprehensive agreement, I think what Michael said about implementation and enforcement, I think that's going to be very, very important. And I think we now have at the EU level a trade enforcement officer as well. David, you didn't have that when you were looking after trade. But that I think is quite an interesting development. And it's part of what I was saying about beefing up our own defenses, if you like. And then I just wanted to say that in terms of transatlantic conversations, they've been going on China and Asia for some time now. And I think these will continue. What we're also having are conversations on these issues with Japan, with Korea, with India. And I think that these can be bilateral or they can be all together, but these conversations are taking part, and none of these conversations take part without having a focus on China or the Indo-Pacific. So we're having this discussion with Australia, with New Zealand. So we bring it all together, and then we also, as Michael has said, I think it's very important, not exclude China from it, because when, as Macron and Merkel have said, ganging up against China is absolutely self-defeating. We cannot live in this one world without having China as a partner and, of course, as a competitor as well. So I just end with that. I think transatlantic discussions and conversations, if they're sane, if they're between equal partners, if there's no bullying there, if we're not just kowtowing to American precepts, I think is very, very useful.
Do I have a moment to add? I would just simply say that in addition to having to work together, that is the US with its friends and allies in Asia and Europe, to work out ways to, if you will, deal with China, I think our US friends and allies in Asia and Europe also need to discuss among themselves how to deal with the United States. Because I think both sides need restraining, and they need policies of restraint and engagement in both directions. But I think if Europe and Asia can coordinate and interact more effectively about their interests and try to push the United States in a more moderate direction, that will be a good outcome as well.
Well, listen, this has been an absolute delight. We talked in one of the preparatory sessions about the fact that covering this range of issues in 1 hour doesn't enable us to do full justice, but I think you've both done a remarkable job in highlighting the most important elements of this discussion, which is certainly going to be with us for many months to come. I'd like to thank you very much, Michael, for joining us from DC.
Thank you.
I commend to everyone your excellent study on a new East Asia strategy with the Quincy Institute, which is available online and well worth a read. Shada, as always, thank you so much for your continued commitment to the EPC, but also your deep knowledge of all things Asian and trying to persuade us in Europe that we do need to remember how important Asia is. So another good job done today. So I thank you all very much. I thank the participants online and look forward to continuing this doubtless in the future in other fora. Thank you both very much indeed, and good evening.
Thank you,
David. Thank you, Shada.
Thank you, Michael.
Great seeing you.
Bye.